Now, one thing I didn't mention on the last example is completing the square and quadratic formula. These are two methods that work all the time. Sometimes you can do it by factoring, but factoring does not always work. The square root property does not always work. But completing the square and quadratic formula work every time. So it's important that you know one of these two methods. So now, the quadratic formula is actually derived by completing the square. And I'm not going to go over that in this video. But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about the quadratic formula. This is probably my favorite method to use. So to do the quadratic formula, the first thing you got to do is make the equation equal to 0. It is. And then make sure these are organized and from highest power to lowest power. They call that descending order. And then we're going to identify the coefficients A, B, and C. A is the coefficient of x squared. B is the coefficient of x. And then C is the constant. So that's A, that's B, that's C. Okay? Now, what am I going to do with A, B, and C? I'm going to plug in A, B, and C into the quadratic formula. Now, when I write the quadratic formula, I do these little dorky blanks. And why I do that? Because these tell me anytime I see a letter like A, B, or C, I'm putting blanks in those spots. And I'm doing that because that tells me in those spots, I'm going to be plugging in a letter. So negative B, but I don't put B, I just put a blank. B squared minus 4. Now you notice I actually write down 4 because it's always going to be 4 there, and you're always going to have 2 on the bottom. So I'm going to plug in the values. This is very simple. I'm going to match up. I'm going to plug in these values to their corresponding blanks. So negative B. What's B? B is 2, so I'll put 2 there. Plus or minus the square root of B squared. So B squared, 2 squared, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2a, all over 2 times 2. Okay? So that you plug it in the quadratic formula. Now we need to simplify. So when you simplify, you want to simplify everything around the plus or minus. Okay? Everything around the plus or minus. So I'm going to start here. What's a negative times 2? That's negative 2. What's 2 times 2? That's 4. Now I'm going to deal with the square root. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what this expression underneath the square root is equal to. This is, by the way, called the discriminant. We're going to talk about that in the next example. B squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant. So I'm going to figure out what the discriminant is. So 2 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 1. That's 12. So what's underneath the square root? 12 is underneath the square root. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify this number here by breaking down the greatest or the factor tree. So 12, how do you multiply to 12? 4 and 3, 2 and 2. So I'll go until each end of the branch is prime. And then I'm looking for a pair. Do I have a pair of anything? Well, I have a pair of 2s. So what that means is I can take out 1, 2 with a pair of 2s. What did not pair up at the end of the branch? 3. So 3 stays in there. So now I'm going to work on simplifying this answer. Okay, now there's only so much I can do here. You've got a couple of options here. You could divide each piece by 4, or you could just leave it all together here. But you notice that this, and this, these 3 all have a common factor. By the way, you're not looking at this when you simplify. You're just looking at the coefficient in front of the square root, not what's inside the square root. You're looking at these 3 values and you're going to say, do they have anything in common? They all have 2 in common. So I can divide each term by 2 to simplify it. So negative 1 plus or minus 1 squared root of 3 divided by 2. And so then I'll ask myself, can I go any further? Well, these aren't like terms, so I'm stuck there. So that's my answer. Now you might need to, if you're doing a comma separated list, negative 1 plus square root of 3 divided by 2, and negative 1 minus square root of 3 divided by 2, you might need to do a comma separated list if you're doing it, if you're writing it into the computer. So that's using the quadratic formula. So it's important that you either know this method or completing the square because you've got to be able to have a method that works every single